The wind across the sands of Karbala whispered a memory that would never die. His hands steady, yet heart thunderous, Abbas tightened the ropes of the empty mashk slung across his shoulder. In the distance, the shimmering ribbon of the Euphrates teased with the promise of water. Behind him, tents fluttered like desperate prayers in the heat, each one housing a child whose lips cracked with thirst. Among them, Bibi Sakina's faint voice had trembled, "Chacha, a little water." That whisper was now a storm in Abbas's chest. Centuries later, a similar wind howled through the broken alleys of Gaza. Smoke clung to the morning like grief, rising from the shattered skeletons of homes that once echoed with laughter. Beneath a charred balcony, a boy named Yosef crouched beside an overturned water barrel. Flies buzzed over the stagnant puddle inside it. His face, streaked with ash and fatigue, betrayed no tears, only the silent discipline of someone who had long stopped asking why. He adjusted the medical bag on his back and scanned the street ahead, his breath catching at the sight of a little girl clutching her infant brother, both draped in soot and silence. Yosef knew their names, Mariam and Rami, siblings whose parents were vaporized 2 days ago in the strike that flattened the schoolyard. Mariam hadn't spoken since. She only stared, her wide eyes asking questions no language could translate. Rami cried without sound, too weak to scream. The water trucks hadn't come in 3 days. And the well near the mosque had run dry yesterday. But what haunted Yosef more than the hunger and disease creeping through Gaza's veins was the thirst. That same, ancient thirst. The kind that stripped children of innocence and left behind only cracked lips and sunken eyes. He remembered a night from his childhood when his grandfather had sat beside a lantern and told him of a lion-hearted uncle who had once ridden into an army to fetch water, not for himself, but for children crying in their tents. "You know who Abbas was," the old man had said. "He was the kind of man who carried courage in one hand and compassion in the other." Yosef had nodded then, too young to understand. But now, in this battlefield of rubble and ash, Abbas's story no longer belonged to dusty books. It pulsed through him like a vow. He reached for the cracked bottle tucked under his belt and knelt beside Mariam. "Here," he whispered, tipping the last few drops onto a cloth and pressing it to her lips. Her eyes flickered but didn't focus. Her brother whimpered. That was all. A low rumble echoed from the eastern sector, a jet flying too low. Instinctively, Yosef shielded the children with his body, counting the seconds. No explosion came. Not yet. But the promise of death loomed heavy in the sky. "Stay here," he told the girl, gesturing toward the shadow of a fallen wall. She didn't move. He gently took her hand and guided her behind it, then kissed her forehead like a brother might. "I'll be back." Each step away from her felt like treason. But his mission was clear. His boots crunched over broken glass and twisted rebar as he entered what was once the city's community center. Now it was a triage zone, barely standing, its walls scorched, its hallways turned into tunnels of moans and bloody footprints. A child cried from a corner, not more than 4 years old, calling for his mother. Yosef paused, his throat tight. A nurse waved him down. "They say the UN might open the corridor at dawn," she said breathlessly, wiping sweat from her brow. "We need someone to scout the water tower near the clinic. It might still be intact." He didn't hesitate. "I'll go." She blinked at him. "It's in the red zone. The sniper hill's active again." "I know." A silence passed between them, weighted and bitter. "Take a radio," she said finally, pressing it into his hand. "And don't be a martyr." Yosef smiled faintly. "No one chooses that. Thirst does." He turned without another word. In his mind, his grandfather's voice murmured once more, "They cut Abbas's arms," but he still tried to return. He didn't bring water back, but he brought something greater. Outside, the sun had begun its cruel descent. Shadows stretched like fingers over the ruins, and the scent of iron and dust thickened with the heat. Yosef knew the path ahead was a graveyard of bodies and prayers unanswered. But the image of Mariam's parched lips, and of Abbas's fearless stride toward the Euphrates, drove him on. He paused at the threshold of the street, fingers brushing the kyon in his pocket. The weight of it was small, but inside were verses his grandfather once whispered to ward off fear. He closed his eyes. *wa man a hiahau fak animera here and nasa jamian. Whoever saves a single life, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. With that, Yosef stepped into the open, just as the sun cut across the sky in a blaze of defiant gold. He was alone now. A medic with no armor. A soul with no shield. But every heartbeat echoed a name that had once made rivers weep. Abbas. The world outside had narrowed into silence, an eerie, bruised stillness that draped itself over Gaza like a burial shroud. Yosef moved through it with deliberate steps, weaving between ruins and debris, guided only by memory and instinct. The radio crackled against his chest, mostly static, but he clung to its presence like a lifeline. He was heading toward the old medical supply building near the collapsed clinic, the one that was rumored to still have water tanks on the roof. It was risky. The sniper post atop the scorched minaret could see everything. Every window, every jagged shadow, felt like an eye watching him. And yet, he pressed forward, one foot in front of the other, just as Abbas had done so many centuries ago, crossing open ground for the sake of others. The closer he got, the more surreal the landscape became. Toys half buried in rubble, a tricycle crushed beneath a slab of concrete, a Quran torn and fluttering like a wounded bird in the breeze. Nothing screamed louder than the silence of what had once been life. He ducked under a shattered archway and paused to catch his breath. His mind drifted to Mariam. She was probably still sitting behind that broken wall, cradling her brother, trusting that he would return. He had given her that hope, now it was the heaviest thing he carried. Inside the building, the air was thick with dust and something else, sickness, maybe death. He passed the room where he once treated his first patient, a boy who had stepped on a cluster bomb. That boy hadn't survived. But his laughter before the pain had been contagious. Yosef forced the memory away. He didn't have time to grieve the dead right now. The staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed, careful to avoid the missing steps. At the top, the rooftop welcomed him with blistering sun and a clear view of the western quarter, now nothing but char and smoke. The tank stood at the far end, still intact, its silver belly bulging like a promise. He approached it cautiously, praying under his breath. The valve groaned when he turned it, and to his amazement, water trickled out. Murky, but wet. He laughed quietly, a brief, mad laugh born out of desperation and disbelief. He filled 2 canisters and secured them in his satchel. Then, as he turned to leave, a sharp crack rang through the air. A bullet pinged off the metal just inches from his leg. Yosef dropped to the ground, heart pounding, ears ringing. The sniper had spotted him. He crawled behind the tank, breath ragged, mind racing. Another shot, this one closer. There was no clear exit. The stairs were now an open kill zone. He could wait until dusk, maybe sneak out in the shadows. But time wasn't a luxury he had. Mariam was fading. Rummy could barely lift his head. They needed water now. He exhaled slowly, then whispered, "Ya Abbas." Not as a plea for escape, but for strength. For resolve. For a reminder that even without arms, Abbas had turned back toward the tents, still carrying water, still trying. Drawing a shaky breath, Yosef unstrapped his white medical cloth from his shoulder and tied it to a steel rod. He raised it slowly above the tank, a gesture not of surrender, but of humanity. Maybe, just maybe, the sniper would understand. Maybe he still had a soul. The silence that followed was louder than gunfire. Then, impossibly, no shots came. Yosef waited 5 more seconds. Then 10. He moved. Slowly, deliberately, he crawled down the opposite side of the roof, lowering himself into the alley using a frayed electrical cord. His palms burned, but he landed in the dirt with the canisters intact. Alive. He ran. The city blurred around him, buildings melting into streaks of light and shadow. His legs ached, lungs screamed, but he didn't stop. He ran past graves still warm, past mothers screaming names no longer answered, past all the reasons he should have given up. When he reached the spot where he had left Mariam and Rummy, his heart nearly broke. The girl was slumped over her brother, lips cracked, skin pale. She hadn't moved. Panic surged through him. He knelt beside her, touched her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then widened slightly as she saw the canister in his hand. "Water," she rasped, the first word she'd spoken in days. He unscrewed the lid, soaked a cloth, and pressed it gently to her mouth. Then to Rummy's. The boy stirred, his tiny fingers curling around Yosef's wrist. A sound caught in Yosef's throat, a sob or a prayer, he couldn't tell. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered. Mariam nodded faintly. In that moment, her eyes didn't hold questions anymore. Only belief. Yosef sat back, exhausted, watching as the children slowly came back to life with each drop. Around them, the war still raged. But here, in this sliver of shade, hope was reborn. He leaned against the wall, eyes turned toward the sky. The same sun that once watched Abbas ride to the river now bore witness to another act of defiance. And in its golden silence, Yosef felt a truth settle into his bones. Sometimes, to carry water is to carry the world. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that turned the ruins of Gaza into a graveyard of light and memory. Yosef stood at the edge of the makeshift shelter where Mariam and Rummy now slept, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, their breaths shallow but steady. The canister beside them was nearly empty. The water had bought time, but not enough. He knew it. The infections spreading through the camp were not waiting for mercy. They never did. The clinic had no antibiotics left. Every day, more children came in with burns, shrapnel wounds, and now, dehydration-induced seizures. And worse, some never came at all, buried in silence beneath the rubble before they could scream. Yosef pressed a cold cloth to his temple, trying to block out the cries from the tents beyond. The burden was not just physical, it was in his soul, in the widening cracks of his spirit. He had chosen to stay, yes. But the weight of staying was beginning to break him. He walked through the maze of the camp, stepping over cables and broken beams, greeting the old woman with the burned hands, the boy with one eye who still played with a crushed toy car. Each nod, each glance, reminded him that they expected something from him, hope, courage, maybe even salvation. He had none left to give. At the edge of the camp, a man approached, face gaunt, beard unkempt, holding a blood-stained cloth. "My daughter," he said. "She needs water, clean water. Please." Yosef looked at him and said nothing. He had no more water. No more answers. That night, the camp lights flickered under the weak charge of a donated generator. Yosef sat alone, knees drawn to his chest, eyes fixed on the horizon. He remembered his grandfather's words again, not the stories of Abbas's strength, but of his surrender. Not surrender to the enemy, but to God. To the will of truth, even in defeat. Abbas didn't return with water, his grandfather had once whispered. But still, Sakina waited at the door of the tent. A child's faith. That was what had made Abbas's sacrifice eternal. The next morning, the camp woke to new gunfire. The shelling had started again, this time near the central water tower. A plume of smoke curled upward like a dying breath. Then came the scream of a volunteer. Someone had spotted a reserve tank near the edge of the red zone. Not much, but enough to save maybe a dozen more. But the zone was a death trap now. No one volunteered. No one but Yosef. He didn't say goodbye. He just packed the cloths, tied the canisters to his sides again, and left at dawn. The streets were quiet, deadly. The air smelled of scorched metal and dried blood. He moved quickly, ducking between shadows, heart hammering. Every corner turned felt like it could be his last. And yet, he kept walking, haunted by faces he couldn't lose. At the final alley before the tower, he paused. A sniper's shot shattered the concrete beside his head. He dropped, rolled into a doorway, heart slamming against his ribs. He lay there, breathing dust. Then, he remembered Abbas again, arms gone, yet still clutching the mashk with his teeth, still crawling back toward the tents. Yosef gritted his teeth and crawled forward. His fingers bled as they scraped over concrete and glass. Another bullet whizzed past, biting into the wall inches from his leg. But he didn't stop. By the time he reached the tank, his hands shook from fatigue. He turned the valve. The sound of water rushing out was both a miracle and a song. He filled both canisters, tied them tight, and turned to leave. But as he stepped back, a shot rang out. A blinding pain seared through his side. He staggered, dropped to one knee, arms clutched around the canisters. He could not fall. Not now. Dragging himself against the wall, he shuffled back through the alley. Blood trailed behind him, but he pressed on. Step. Breath. Stumble. Another step. The streets blurred. The sky above dimmed. He could no longer tell if it was evening or if he was fading. But finally, he reached the edge of the camp. Someone screamed his name. Hands reached out and pulled him in. The canisters were lifted from his arms. He tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, "Give it to Mariam first." And then darkness swallowed him. When Yusef awoke, it was night. The stars above blinked like the eyes of angels. Mariam sat beside him, holding a cup of water. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't. "You came back," she said. Yusef managed a faint nod. She pressed the cup to his lips. The water was warm, slightly bitter, but it tasted like life. The camp was quiet now. No bombs. No bullets. Just the hum of breath, the echo of hope returning. Later, the children would draw his name in chalk on the walls. They would tell the story of a man who walked into fire for water, who didn't bring miracles, but brought mercy. And in the heart of Gaza, his name would be whispered just as Abbas's was, softly, reverently. Not for the fight he gave, but for the thirst he tried to quench. The days that followed passed like fading echoes, each one marked by dust, blood, and the quiet persistence of survival. Yusef's wounds had begun to heal, stitched clumsily by trembling hands, and covered with more prayer than medicine. He could barely walk, but still he sat near the tents each morning, cradling the radio in his lap, listening for a call, for a name, for anything that sounded like relief. Most days, the airwaves carried only static. On better days, distant voices whispered updates too slow to matter. But he listened anyway. Hope had long since stopped being rational, it was muscle memory now. Mariam came to him each day, holding a notebook with a broken pencil. She'd begun to draw again. Her silence had been replaced with color, the bright blue of the sea she'd never seen, the gold of the sun that still scorched the ruins, and the deep red she used only to draw Yusef's shirt. In every sketch, he was running, always toward something, water, light, the children who waited. He didn't know whether to smile or cry. One afternoon, the air grew still, too still. Yusef knew what that meant. A silence that heavy never came without reason. He stood shakily, leaning on a broken crutch fashioned from a shattered table leg. Across the field of rubble, a line of tanks appeared, dusty and slow, crawling like beasts with metal teeth. Panic spread. Mothers grabbed children. The infirm tried to rise. No one had the strength for another displacement, another loss. He didn't panic. He simply watched. Then, from behind the tanks, a convoy of aid trucks emerged. Real ones. Bearing the insignia of a neutral nation. Flags of peace fluttered like feathers. The soldiers waved white scarves, not weapons. He blinked, uncertain whether it was real or a cruel mirage. But when they reached the gates of the camp, and water barrels were rolled out, and food packets handed with trembling smiles, the sob that broke from Yusef's chest was not just relief, it was release. Children cried. Mothers wept. Even the wounded tried to stand. Yusef didn't rush forward. He stayed where he was, watching as others ran, arms raised, toward what felt like salvation. He'd done what he could. The fight was not over, but for now, it had bent. And that, too, was victory. Later, as dusk fell and the sound of celebration softened into exhausted rest, Yusef sat outside his tent, staring at the clouds. Mariam approached, her notebook pressed to her chest. She sat beside him, opened the pages, and pointed to a new drawing. It was Abbas. Not how history usually painted him, not with sword raised or arms severed, but kneeling in the sand, offering a mash to a child with gentle eyes. In the background stood a young man, modern, in paramedic uniform, blooded and tired. Mariam had drawn them both under the same sun. He looked at her, eyes wide. She whispered, "You remind me of him." Yosef didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, when the moon rose full over the camp, he walked to the far end where the oldest water tank stood, empty now, but sacred in its emptiness. It had once held life. It had once been a battlefield. He sat at its base and pulled out the small, worn Qur'an from his pocket. The pages were stained, torn at the edges, but the words still lived. He opened to a marked verse, one his grandfather had circled years ago. Do not think of those who are slain in the path of Allah as dead. Nay, they are alive with their Lord, receiving sustenance. He closed the book gently. The war had not ended. The bombs would fall again. The thirst would return. But something had shifted. In the face of despair, people had chosen defiance. In the heart of a medic who once doubted his worth, there now lived a fire that even bullets could not extinguish. In another part of the world, Karbala still breathed. Not just in stories, but in lives. In Gaza's cracked soil, in the eyes of its children, in every hand that carried water despite knowing it might not return. Yosef looked to the stars, those same stars that once watched Abbas take his final steps. He imagined them whispering his name, too. Not for glory, not for martyrdom, but for mercy, for water, for refusing to stay silent. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet beyond this world, a voice answered, not loud, but steady. You were never alone.